Welcome everyone this is the last webinar of a series in celebration of Refugee Week 2020. This is part of the series of webinars from Bilingualism Matters. Today we're very delighted to have Dr. Katherine Asrani, who is an associate professor of cultural studies at the University of Heriot University in Edinburgh. Just a short introduction. My name is Marianne Azar. I'm a volunteer here at Bilingualism Matters. I'm doing a master's in psychology of language. I'll be in conversation with Dr. Katherine Asrani today. And then there will be in the Q&A session, Maria. Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm also a volunteer. My name is Maria Dokovova, and I'm a student in speech and language therapy at Queen Margaret University. And my role is to look for your questions. So there is a Q&A section at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. I'll be gathering these questions, and later on, I think Marianne will explain halfway through, I will join in and start asking your questions. So I'll be on for most of it, okay?
So the Q&A session starts at 2:30. For now, we have gathered a few questions that were given to us previously when we were advertising the event, and so I'll be in conversation with Katerina in order to answer these questions. So, Katerina, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit more about yourself first.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd just like to start by saying thank you so much to Bilingualism Matters and to all of you, to Eva Maria, to Christy, Marianne, Maria, Kat, for inviting me to take part in this webinar series. So I'm Katherine Asrani, and I work at the Department of Languages and Intercultural Studies at Heriot. I'm from Thessaloniki in Greece, which is obviously the coolest city in the world. And I've been living in Scotland for 22 years. I've also spent time in Belgium and Russia as a student. My background is in languages and politics, and my current research is in the field of cultural studies. I am particularly interested in the interplay of language, culture, and society, which is one of the reasons why I'm particularly pleased to be with you today and to be having this conversation with you. And also, I'm interested in the multicultural dimension of citizenship and of contemporary citizenship, and the role of multilingualism in societies. I have a book coming out in August, and the title is Multilingualism and Politics. The book will be published by Margaret. I've also had an interest in racist discourse and in hate communication. I've had this interest for a long time, since my undergraduate dissertation years, and that's a bit of a long story, and if you want, we can discuss it later. But anyway, I've always wanted to investigate these issues further. So back in 2014, I was lucky to be able to collaborate on an EU-funded project, on a 2-year project called RADAR, and that stands for Regulating Anti-Discrimination and Anti-Racism. That was led by the University of Perugia in Italy. And over the course of the years, I've had the opportunity to work on other projects, such as Moving Languages, where we developed an app for newly arrived migrants and refugees in 4 or 5 countries, I think it was. There was another project called Intertrainee, which stands for Intercultural Training for Educators, that is still ongoing. And there was another project on digital inclusion of Rohingya refugees in Malaysia, and that project was led by my colleague, Gina Neto. So I was lucky enough to be able to participate in projects that I was very interested in on a personal and academic level. So overall, these are my interests. And so I'm very pleased to be participating in this conversation, because I hope I'll be able to answer any questions you may have, but also I'd like very much to hear your views as people who have probably been affected by some of the issues we will discuss. And I think in relation to this, Marianne, you have a poll that you will be starting at some point.
Yes, so right before we jump into the conversation, here right in front of you, you can see a poll. If you can just tick all that apply to you, we would like to know who's with us here today in the audience. So tick all that apply, and hopefully this will help us tailor the questions and answers better to suit the audience. All right. Okay, so you can see that a vast majority of the people are bilinguals, and in fact work with bilinguals. So that's something very nice to see. Quite a lot of refugees as well. All right, so quite an interesting audience we have today. All right, so let's jump into the conversation then. So Katerina, you mentioned that you have an app, the Moving Languages app. So first of all, how did you get the idea of developing such an app?
Well, the idea wasn't strictly mine, so I don't want to take all the credit for it.
Yeah.
I had a very good working relationship with a company called Learn Mera in Finland, and this company develops language apps. So due to this working relationship, we had a chat because my colleague said, why don't you get involved in the development of language apps? And I was very reluctant because I thought, language apps, you can't learn a language through an app. But this was in 2016. And if you remember 2016, there was a lot of talk in the media about refugees and smartphones. And I remember very well being very angry, watching various media reports, commenting on the fact that refugees have smartphones. And for some reason, this was very strange, to some people. How dare these refugees come to our countries with the latest smartphone, not realizing that a smartphone for somebody who is a forced migrant is actually a survival tool. It's not a luxury item. So in this sort of framework, and thinking that smartphones are imperative for people who are migrating, who are forced migrants, really, I said, well, my colleague is developing apps. Why don't we develop an app for people who are newly arrived in this country and would like a tool to be able to start their life, teach them a little bit about the language, but also teach them a little bit about the culture, since they have the smartphones already, and they are technologically savvy. So that's how it started, really.
Yeah, well, that's very nice that you made language learning something very accessible. But I wanted to ask which languages did you start in, and what languages is it available in now? Who's your audience? Who uses the app?
So I had to look this up because I had forgotten. I said 5 countries in the beginning. I apologize, it's 6 countries that participate in Moving Languages. So a group of partners got together from Finland, Sweden, Italy, Austria, Spain, and the UK. And what we did was we looked at, as part of this project, we looked at migration statistics in these countries. That's we looked at the official statistics because that was the best we could do in terms of finding approximate numbers of refugees or approximate numbers of migrant languages, to get at least an indication of what in these countries they were called, in other countries they were called migrant languages. So anyway, we looked at the top languages that were spoken. And for the UK, for example, the top 3 languages were Arabic, Polish, and Punjabi. So we took the 3 top languages in each country. And when there was an overlap, we looked at the next languages, because we wanted to have at least 18 languages in this app. And we ended up having 26. So that's how we came up with the combination.
And what was the feedback from the refugee community that used the app?
So when we started, we wanted this to be co-constructed because we felt that if we just did something purely on market analysis, we wouldn't get anywhere, or we would get somewhere that probably wasn't going to be very useful. So what we did before, while we were developing the app, we sent out surveys, we sent out questionnaires, asking people, okay, we're developing this app, what would you like to see? And actually this information helped us a lot with some of the categories in the app. So whereas we had a lot of feedback, fair enough, it was anonymous, but a lot of feedback in the stage of developing the app, we didn't manage to get as much feedback afterwards from users. We ran some workshops and we did get some refugees in the workshops, but we mostly got people who worked for refugee organizations. Some of them were refugees themselves, but others, worked in refugee organizations. So we did get feedback from them, but I personally would have wanted some more feedback from, from refugees. We got a little, but I'm not sure how representative it is. The feedback we got was very positive, because we had languages such as Tigrinya or Somali, for example, and we got feedback, oh, finally, we didn't know there was an app that offered Tigrinya or Somali, thank you very much. But we didn't manage to get feedback that was specific. For example, I don't know, a word that was missing, or, something concrete that helped them. So hopefully, if anyone is listening today and you'd like to use the app, please send us some more feedback, because I personally would like to see if this has worked as we wanted it to work. It has had 4,000 downloads in all these countries. So in terms of downloads, it's been a very successful app, but I would personally like to see if it was actually useful to people. So please do tell me if it was.
Katerina, there was something while looking up the app. There was something I was really impressed by, is that it has a cultural tab. It's not just it's not like another just another language learning app. It has about the culture of the language. So could you tell us more about that? Why is it so important for someone learning a language to also learn the culture along with it?
It's imperative, if you ask me. Obviously, I am in cultural studies, so of course I would tell you that culture is very important. But for English in particular, so let's say somebody, comes to the UK and wants to learn English in order to combat linguistic isolation, which is one of the main problems that newly arrived migrants have when they come here and they don't speak the language. You could download any app to learn English, but there are many English-speaking countries out there. So, I really don't think that one app could teach you English in order to be able to live in the US or in Australia or in Canada or in the UK. You really need to have the cultural, at least, information. Again, an app can't teach you the culture, but it can give you some information to start with. An app is a tool to help you to learn something. I think we've had this discussion before, when I was younger and when I was learning my languages, obviously there was not, all this technology wasn't there. So what we had was videotapes or, cassette tapes that we would listen to in order to help us with our language learning. The app is supposed to be that as well. It's a tool. It's not supposed to teach you the language on its own. So the culture tab, for example, has things like information about everyday life, about food, about the role of certain things. I think we have a separate tab about the NHS, which I have found as a migrant in the UK has a very important role, not just because it is the National Health Service, but it has a cultural role as well. It's at the heart of people's psyche. I remember in London 2012, in the Olympics, it was part of the ceremony, the opening ceremony. It's part of, it's part of the people, of the psyche. And we also had some other terms such as, again, because it was 2016, we had to explain terms such as referendum, devolution, because this is Scotland. I didn't know what the term devolution meant, before I moved to Scotland and before, I learned about the politics of the country. So there are some country specific, if you don't want to call it culture, that's fine. At least here, it's country specific terms and concepts that people need to know about. And again, we co-constructed these. So when we asked, what would you like to know about? It was things like, oh, we'd like to know about, how the administration works, or, how to talk to the police, or how to do, and we did all that.
Mm-hmm. So I find that this attention to cultural learning, I mean, you being an associate professor of cultural studies, but it also ties in very nicely to your other project, Intercultural training for educators. So could you tell us more about the importance of educators being aware of the different cultures found in their classrooms when teaching languages?
Again, I would say that it's very important. You know, it's so we know. Let me start from this.
Mm-hmm.
Educators know, anyone who's taught anything knows that learners are different. Not every learner is the same. Not everybody learns in the same way. And we know that instead of trying to adjust the learners to the material, we should really adjust the material to the learners. It's a much more effective way of learning and teaching. So when we have a classroom with people from different backgrounds and with such a vast range of experiences, then that is an even more challenging task. I can give the example, you know, in a classroom we could have a mixture of rich international students, poor international students, poor home students, rich home students, students who are care experienced, students who are refugees,
Mm-hmm.
people, learners, you know, anyone from different ethnic backgrounds, so from having different experiences, and also people who come from different educational systems. So we have, again, we distributed a questionnaire as part of this project, and we asked educators, do you think that you have the tools to be able to respond to learners' needs in these contexts? And most people said no. And those who said that they had the tools stated that we developed the tools by ourselves. We were never taught. So when we were trained as educators in whichever way, there was not an intercultural element into it, you know, in the learning and teaching sort of discipline. So we thought there was something lacking there, and it's been very useful. The project is still ongoing, but it's been quite eye-opening, I think, for all of us.
Mm-hmm. It kind of reminds me of, there was this show on the BBC, I think it was called Mind Your Language. That's sort of what it reminds me of, there being such different people learning the same language. So that's something we can think of. But also, I mean, along with being from a linguistic background comes a cultural background as well. And so
yes, and
there might be some profiling. Mm-hmm. No,
if I could add something, I could speak personally, you know, as an example. So I'm from Greece, and I came here as a student. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first day when I went to university, and I was completely lost because I could speak the language very well. The Scottish accent I had a bit of a problem with at first, but then, you know, it was fine after a couple of weeks. But, you know, there was no language problem really, but it was purely an educational background problem. I was taught, or I was educated back home, to be respectful to such a degree to my professors, to my lecturers, that I was taught never to challenge them. So there was no critical attitude there at all. I was waiting for the almighty professor to give me the answers to everything, for me to write them down, learn them by heart, and go. And there are many other educational systems that were like that. So I had to sort of retrain myself and to be more open, to be more critical, to challenge, which didn't come naturally to me because I was educated differently. And that's not uncommon in some classrooms. And it's useful for somebody who is teaching to know that you have a range of students who, you know, just because they're silent in class, it doesn't mean that they have nothing to say. It might be because they think that if they challenge you, it will be offensive, for example.
Yeah, and also it must be quite different from someone who's learning a language for necessity. For example, a refugee who comes to a country needs to learn the language. It is imperative for them to learn a language, as opposed to an international student that might come to, as you said, Finland, for example. So have you seen a difference between someone learning a language for fun, let's say, or out of pleasure, and then for necessity?
Yeah, I remember we discussed this question previously, and I had a hard time depicting or sort of imagining somebody who's like, oh, I just want to learn a language for fun. I mean, I know people do, but then for fun has different reasons. So somebody might learn a language because they want the brain challenge, the cognitive challenge, because there are proven cognitive advantages to being bilingual, or to at least speak different languages. People say, you know what, I'll learn a language because it's good for my brain. Fantastic. Someone might want to learn a language because they want to travel somewhere and they just want to learn a little bit. All these reasons are different, and obviously the way people learn the language is different. For example, somebody who learns a language for brain training will make sure that they will learn the grammar correctly. They will start memorizing. They will focus more on exercises and tests in order to develop, their brain, and they will be more systematic and more methodic. Learning for fun, I guess they might, also use all these fancy tools like apps to learn it for fun. But I don't know, it's probably because I never had to learn a language for fun. I've always had to learn it, for study or for work.
Yeah.
So, and I never had to teach a language for fun, which is why I find it hard to imagine what it would be like. But I'm guessing, and this is purely a guess, I'm guessing that maybe grammar wouldn't be that important, or, a wide range of vocabulary wouldn't be important. But then if we move to learning a language as a necessity, newly arrived migrants or refugees, as you say, then...
Yeah, they need it to integrate into a culture, for example. So actually, refugees having to learn a new language, they also have to assimilate to a new culture. How important is it to, perhaps, you would find them that they would maybe not want to teach their children the language as a means of integrating to the new culture? I mean, is that necessary? Is it necessary to let go of your previous culture to assimilate into the new culture, or your language as well?
That is a fantastic question. So, firstly, I have to admit, I really disagree with the term assimilate or assimilation, probably because it reminds me, as an academic, it reminds me of models of assimilation, melting pots and things like that, and which I do not agree with, and also, they've been proven to not work. So I wouldn't call it assimilation. There's a problem with all this terminology, but assimilation is definitely not what I would use. So in terms of, you've just mentioned home language, so which language we speak to the children. There used to be the notion that in order to help children integrate, we need to speak to them to the host language, because that's going to help them integrate more. Now, there have been countless studies on this, and I think we have now proved that this is not the case, that children, the younger the children are, actually the easier I think they will learn the language. But it doesn't matter, it's very easy for children to learn the host language because they they go to school. The best thing to do, and as parents we are told this, but also academics are also finding it, the best thing to do is to actually keep your keep your home language, keep the language you ordinarily would speak to your child. Keep that as the home language, and then the child will, the host language will take care of itself, basically, through schooling and through others. So I would like to sort of move away from this view that I know that a lot of parents will do it because they think that they're helping their children, but really they will help their children more if they continue speaking the home language, because actually the danger is for the child to lose its native language, if you like. That is a far greater danger than, not integrating. They will integrate, they will learn. They cannot go to school and not learn the language.
Yeah.
I hope
we mentioned it on Monday that oddly that COVID-19 sort of got people to practice their home languages more now that the children are spending more time at home, so they're learning the home language much more and more. So that's one small silver lining of current events. But I mean, how How harmful would it be to just as a parent, for example, decide that, okay, we're going to stop speaking the home language just for pure, I mean, it's not out of ill will, it's probably out of goodwill from the parent to just stop for the child, to teach them the home language, saying that let them focus on the new language. How harmful would that be?
It depends, you know, harmful. In the end, it comes down to personal choice. However, we all know, I know that the audience now have said that most of them are bilinguals or work with bilinguals, so we all know the benefits of bilingualism. So there's the benefits of bilingualism, but also with bilingualism comes, not always, but in most of the cases comes biculturalism.
Yeah.
And if we decide for any reason, or, you know, if there are circumstances, because as you say, sometimes parents just cannot, because I don't know, they work all day, they don't spend much time with the children at home, you know, they forget sometimes their native language because of many years, you know, living in a host language. So for whatever reason, sometimes there is oppression, you know, and they're not allowed to speak their own language. So
Yeah.
for whatever reason, let's say they do not speak the language, and the language, let's say it's lost and the child doesn't speak it.
They might fear some racism, perhaps. I mean, especially now in recent global news, recent developments, that we might be aware that some people might fear speaking a language, a minority language, especially because of racism. So have you seen that in your own studies? What role does speaking a foreign language in a community contribute? How much does that contribute to being profiled as something or being treated in a racist way or something? Okay,
I'll come to that. I'll finish my previous point first, because I think this whole idea about how harmful is it to lose the home language is quite important. Because there's learning languages or being bilingual, you know, for the language element, but there's also the culture and the heritage element. So when there is a sense that a language as part of someone's identity, as part of someone's culture, as part of someone's heritage is lost, then that is a great shame, to say the least. I personally believe that it's harmful to society, actually, to lose cultures and languages that could enrich a society to a great level. So, you know, and if parents feel oppressed to such a degree that they have to stop speaking their language to their children out of fear of racism, for example, like you said, then there's a problem with society that we need to look at. Then we need to create societies where people feel that they are, you know, they are safe and they're encouraged, and they have the tools to maintain their home languages and, you know, their home cultures and their heritages, whatever you want to, whatever, you know, someone feels calling it. You know, because otherwise I think it's a great loss to society, not just to the person, but, you know, to the society. Now, you mentioned language and racism, or speaking languages and racism, and that's a huge point, actually. And unfortunately, certain languages are targeted more than others. I have a colleague who wrote an article recently for The Conversation, speaking, and the article was talking about the Arabic language and how, unfortunately, the Arabic language has now become, you know, has now become different. So how, I'm not an Arabic speaker, so I can't comment, but it would be interesting for people who are Arabic speakers to say, how safe do you feel speaking Arabic in public spaces?
Just a quick plug-in. If anyone wants to ask questions in Arabic in the comments, I'm a native speaker of Arabic, so if you just want to post those in Arabic, I can translate them into the Q&A. So one final question to you, Katerina, and on a lighter note, which is something that we have heard so much, probably as people working in language sciences. What is your answer to people when they ask, do bilinguals really have two identities? So this will be our final question before moving on to Q&As.
Oh, you know, for people who don't know anything about languages, they say, oh yeah, we have many personalities. It's really scary. So there are many jokes you can make about these things. And I remember actually joking once that if I spoke better German, I would be more organized as a person. You know, using the stereotypes that we use about people. But again, it comes back to the question, you know, in all seriousness, it comes back to the question of bilingualism and biculturalism. So if a bilingual is also bicultural, then I guess you could have more than one identities. But again, identity is something that is identity, yes, is something that can be ascribed, but it's something that is quite personal. We identify as something. So I don't necessarily mean I don't necessarily think if you speak many languages, you have different identities, but in order to truly be bicultural, then you do change, you know, when you speak a different language in the context of a different culture. I can give you many examples from, not from myself, because, you know, I'm not a very good example, but I can give you an example of my daughter who's bilingual and bicultural, and, you know, Greek and English. And I can tell you that anytime she needs to nag, moan, or be dramatic, it can only be in Greek. And, you know, anything else that's a little bit more temperate or more serious has to be in English. So.
All right. So, all right, thank you very much. And so now we'll jump into Q&As. So we'll be answering questions from the attendees here. And I'll give the floor to Maria. And so feel free to ask all of your questions. And if there's no time to answer all these questions, don't you worry, we'll answer them to you personally, or keep an eye out on social media and you'll find your answers if there's no time to answer them in this session. All right, so on to Q&As.
That was such an interesting discussion. Thanks again to both of you for participating and doing that. We've had only a couple of questions, I think, so far. So I would like to welcome everyone again and remind you that you can post your questions in the Q&A section. That will be easiest for me to read and make sure that everything gets answered. So the first question that we can start with today is, what has been the thing that has most surprised you or that you have learned from delivering intercultural training for educators?
We haven't delivered the training yet. We've just finished designing the training course.
I see.
I can tell you, I can share with you a couple of things that I did learn whilst trying to develop the course. So this project, Intertrainee, in this project we have 4 countries designing the project. There's the UK, Finland, Greece, and Italy. And while we were trying to develop the curriculum for this course, we realized that we had different understandings, for example, of the term migrant. In the beginning, this course was going to be about adult migrants. So it's not for children, it's not, you know, educating children. The learners are adult migrants. And for the Greek and the Italian partners, a migrant was somebody who was either newly arrived or sometimes a refugee, or somebody who wasn't very well educated. Whereas for, you know, the UK and Finland, it was the broader term, you know, it was just somebody who moved into another country. And actually, we had to sort out between ourselves what we meant by migrants first, before we actually designed the course. And I found that really, really useful, because we had to go back to the UN definition of migrant. We have to see, and actually in the reports that we've written for this project and into the curriculum, we put all the different understandings of migrant in all these different countries, because again, it's country specific, it's cultural and all this. So, because you need to know who your learners are in order to develop it. So the course will be finished, the course design actually is finished, but it will be available in 2 weeks' time. So if you want, I can send you a quick link to it, and it's freely available and you'll be able to see it. And it will be great if we get feedback for that, because, you know,
yeah, that would be something probably some of our guests today would be interested in to also have a look at. So you might want to watch this space for more information. But yeah, that's a very interesting point, I guess. Even with the people that you're organizing the course with, you have to find the right language. You have to find the right cultural understanding. It's not just a mechanical translation of the term migrant. It's also all the other cultural baggage that comes with it that is important to interpret. So that's really interesting.
Yes, because there's differences in, you know,
Mm-hmm.
teaching people who have had horrible experiences in the past, who have been through trauma, you know, or just teaching somebody who is an international student who just moved, you know, there's vast differences that we needed to first tease out before we designed a course.
Absolutely. Right, so the next question that we got in is probably something that you would enjoy. It's a question, do you think identity should be interpreted as a fixed notion anyway? Even the same person can assume different identities depending on the community practice they occupy at any specific time. So I thought that would be a question you might like.
Okay, let me see if I understand this correctly. So the question is, do you think identity could be something fixed, but just have many different elements to it?
Yeah, I think as far as I understand, the person is just probably challenging the notion that it can be fixed. So what do you have to say to that?
Well, I don't think identities are fixed. And I think most, you know, the literature, academic literature as well, agrees that academics are more fluid, identities are more fluid than fixed. Academics can be fluid as well, more fluid than fixed. And that identities are dynamic because experiences are dynamic, and experiences shape us. And it can be something quite simple, such as, for example, you know, 10 years ago, I wasn't a mother, and now I am a mother. So that's a difference in my identity. Or, you know, if I had, you know, if I changed some other things about how I feel. But also, I think the person asking was probably referring to identities in terms of where you're from or belonging.
Yeah. And languages probably also, like.
Or languages. So belonging is an element of identity, but which is also quite dynamic. So it, especially in the context of migration, belonging changes. And I think there's a lot of migrants here in this panel, and you know, from the participants as well. And I think most migrants would agree that your sense of belonging changes a little bit. As you know, your migration experience evolves and throughout the migration journey. So there must be fixed elements to someone's identity. For example, but again, that's a choice. For example, I identify myself as Greek, and I will always identify myself as Greek, even though when I go home, I am teased for not really being Greek because you know, you're really Scottish or whatever, all this banter that happens. That's my choice. You know, there are other Greeks or whatever who have moved abroad and do not identify as that anymore because of whatever reason. So it's not as simple as that.
Yeah, fair enough, I guess. So we suddenly have an influx of questions. So I just wanted to say to our guests that if we don't manage to get through all of the questions, they will be answered on our social media or webpage later on. So don't worry about that. So with that in mind, I'm moving on to the next question. What do you think might be some of the reasons behind why it's difficult to get refugees to engage with feedback loops? And if you have any tips for improving engagement?
Sorry, could you say that again? Because the very good connection. Say it again.
Oh dear. Okay, so the question is if you have any idea what might be the reasons why it's so difficult to engage refugees with giving feedback, and if you have any tips on how to improve that.
I don't have any tips because I haven't been able to to reach as many people as I would like myself. But what I have found is that word of mouth is quite, and personal engagement is quite important. So I met a few people in the process who then, you know, realized I was a person of trust, and then they introduced me to other people, and then other people. So through this sort of snowballing method, I managed to find people who would, you know, engage with some of the things we were doing, give me some feedback, tell me if this would be useful for them or not. But, you know, anything that I tried to do sort of from above, oh, I'll send a, you know, a questionnaire, I'll send a link to whatever, didn't really work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that for refugees in particular, probably because of, you know, just that, you know, the context in which, you know, they have to live and they have to work and they have to operate, it's probably difficult, you know, to contact them. But also, this is not just for refugees, this is for anybody who participates in a project or a research project or whatever, needs to see that they're not being taken advantage of, and, you know, there's something in it for them. You know, why would I, and someone would say, well, why would I participate in a project? What would this give for me? You know, I'm not here basically to serve your academic advancement. And I totally agree with that. You know, as academics, we shouldn't be extractivist or anything like that. So I'm afraid I don't have any tips, but what has worked, at least to a degree for me, is that personal, you know, engagement with people, to basically, to establish that trust and say, look, I'm not just someone who's interested in you because of a label that has been put on you. And unfortunately, that label of refugee is really difficult to take off. You know, you know, people are more than that. So once that starts, then things are getting a little bit easier. Yeah. But whoever asked that, or whoever needs, you know, to discuss a bit more, please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to engage with people and, you know, continue the conversation offline if you want.
Yeah, that's, I think you said you don't have tips, but I think you actually gave some really useful information there with your answer. So moving on, we have a question that is actually really relevant regarding some recent events in the world. An anonymous person has asked, in light of recent developments in the discussion around Black Lives Matter and BAME communities, how might this add an additional dimension of complexity when working within refugee contexts, in your experience?
I haven't done much work since the latest developments with refugees. So I can't comment on the second part of the question. I don't know what I can say other than, I think what happened recently has told everybody, or at least has reminded everybody, that racism is a much more complex phenomenon than people who haven't experienced it thought. So, for example, I've done a bit of work on language and racism and hate speech and all this, and language is fundamental in racism, of course, and language use and, you know, influence of language use and all this. But it's not the only dimension. So it doesn't stop there. People can be trained to use the right language, but that doesn't mean, or, you know, they can learn to use the right language, but that doesn't mean that they may not have racist views. Or indeed, you know, commit racist acts. Racism can be embedded in society, can be embedded at work, in education, it can be perpetuated by state law, it can be structural, it can be systemic. It starts from inequalities and lack of opportunities in early life, and that unavoidably leads to inequalities later on in society and employment. So I think what we've seen is that it's very, very important to recognize different forms and manifestations of racism, but also the fact that it's not something of the past. It's something that people experience every day, and just because some people don't see it, it doesn't mean that it's not there. and that we really should pay more attention to people's experiences and people's account of their experiences, rather than, you know, brush them under the carpet and say, oh, well, it's just one person or whatever. You know, it's not, you know, the recent developments has shown that this is a more complex phenomenon and a more urgent phenomenon, I think, than some people had appreciated. I don't know if that answers the question.
I guess in a way it's something that we must keep in mind at all times moving forward. I think that would be like a way to sum it up.
Yeah, it's more than, you know, living in a respectful society is more than just using the right language.
Yes.
You know, it starts from, you know, it goes much deeper, and it starts also from much earlier in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So moving on to another question. Anita is asking, how can multilingualism be integrated in foreign language teaching? And I guess her context is teaching English in Austria. So I guess I would probably interpret that as including more than one language in the process of foreign language teaching. Not sure.
So do you mean, so okay, so someone who's teaching English in Austria, do you mean promoting the benefits of multilingualism, or multilingualism as an ideology, or
it's
just
hard.
The value of, maybe the person who has asked can clarify, because I'm not sure what exactly. I can look at the chat. Did you take it from the chat?
It's from the Q&A section. Yes, Anita, if you can clarify questions. I think different education backgrounds is the clarification. Perhaps make use of languages that learners bring to the classroom and their culture. If you have any experience, yeah, with that. Thank you, Anita.
Yeah, that's clear. Yeah, well, that would be amazing. That's actually something that we have included in the course that we're designing now, the inter-trainee. So, for example, saying it comes under this co-creation and co-construction element, and saying, for example, you know, when you teach English or when you teach a concept, to ask, do you have this concept in your language? You know, how do you call it? What are the differences? And you can have a whole conversation about a particular concept in different languages and in different cultures that engages people. And also in this way, they will always remember it. If you involve people in a discussion. The way I learned languages, I could talk about this forever, but the way I learned languages was so rigid. If I were able to have this critical attitude towards learning a language, where I actually participated in the creation of knowledge, then it would have stayed with me much more than, you know, learning very long vocabulary lists. It did wonders for my memory, but I'm not sure what it did for my language skills. I had to go and spend time in the country to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can relate to that experience as well. And also, as you were saying, if people are engaged to talk about the same concepts in their own languages, that I guess also activates the emotional connection that people have with that language, as you were talking with your daughter who gets upset in Greek. So that is also a very, I guess, emotional way to engage your students.
It might also, if I can add, you know, when you discuss different languages, it depends what languages you have in the classroom, because sometimes languages have similarities. And when you explain the etymology of a word, for example, you could say, oh, you know, this is very similar to XYZ word that you have in this language, or the other word that you have. And when people start sometimes seeing similarities in etymologies between languages, or, you know, how certain languages have influenced others, that is also very useful. I've actually seen this in the classroom, and it has started a conversation that learners remember, so that they will remember that.
Absolutely. Right, so moving on to children learners, somebody is asking if you think that being bilingual can affect potential cognitive skills, and also if it can affect people's cognitive skills, being bilingual. Also, if being bilingual, what does it mean to be fully bilingual? Does it mean to be able to read, speak, and write in every language that you have?
Whoever asked that question, thank you. You're asking a question that I wanted to ask. What actually do you mean bilingual? And I must confess, actually, that bilingualism as such is not my expertise. So I can tell you that there are studies that have shown the cognitive benefits of bilingualism, but I cannot actually quote these studies or tell you exactly what they found, because I haven't conducted them. You know, I'm not an expert means I haven't actually conducted any studies on bilingualism. I think, and I can't give you a definition either, because that would have been my question. My understanding of bilingualism, of someone who is bilingual, and that might be the wrong understanding, but that's my understanding. So my understanding of someone who's bilingual, it means someone who's very comfortable in speaking a language, more or less in the same level as they can speak the language that they consider to be their first. Mm-hmm. If your first language is Bulgarian, for example, and you speak another language and you feel that it's pretty much on the same level, then you can consider yourself bilingual. But that's my understanding. If Antonella Sorace were here, who is the world leading expert on bilingualism, she would have given you the precise answer.
Yeah,
but,
and I can interject and say that perhaps you might want to refer to the session from Monday, where Antonella was answering similar types of questions, and she was talking about how fluid skills are between languages, and that they're never perfectly equal, and people still kind of have to manage with the label of bilingual and how fluid it is.
Exactly, which is why I said if you feel, your perception might not be. It's how comfortable you feel, I think, with the language.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question, which is probably in a similar vein, which is about, do you think it is true that children's language abilities take longer to develop when they have to deal with two languages at home? I think, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I think that's probably from a similar vein, this question.
Again, I was having difficulty.
Sorry.
Something about languages at home.
I'll speak a bit louder. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you find it is true that children's language ability takes longer to develop when they have to deal with two languages at home?
Oh, okay. Again, because I haven't conducted any studies, I don't know. But I can tell you I can just give you my personal experience with my daughter. It took her so my daughter took longer to speak, but when she spoke, she spoke English roughly in the normal time where children start to speak. I was speaking Greek to her from day one, from when she was in the belly, and she wouldn't speak Greek to me. But there was one point when she was 2.5, when I took her back home and she opened her mouth and she spoke 2 perfect sentences, and then she just started speaking. So I think she was just computing all this time. She was listening to me, replying in English, but she was probably working it out for herself, and then suddenly when it came out, it was fine. I can't tell that my experience is representative, but all I can say is that I've read the relevant papers as a parent, not just as an academic, and all I can say with certainty is that there's definitely no negative effects to your child learning 2 languages or even 3 languages at home. It can only be a good thing, and I wish I learned my languages as a child and I didn't have to learn them as an adult.
I think we can all relate to that. Thank you. Right, I think we only have time for
good, somebody gave up. Thank you. So I see in the chat now it says more answers from bilingual parents on our website. Thanks.
Perfect.
So that's about the bilingualism element, which is
yes. Yeah, I was going to say that the Bilingualism Matters website has lots of resources on all of these topics, so you can just dive right in and there will be lots and lots of information. So we have, I think, time probably for one very quick question from Marianne, who was wondering if you have worked with refugees from indigenous backgrounds and if that adds another level of complexity to the work.
So I haven't worked with refugees from indigenous backgrounds, but what we're doing now is I'm working on another project now. I'm actually leading this project now. So we're developing an app for indigenous languages. And we are focusing on Cornish, Sami, Basque. Will I remember them all? Cornish, Sami, Basque, Galician, Scots, and one more language which I'm forgetting, and I will kick myself for it afterwards. But anyway, 6 indigenous languages. So because we are developing this app, we are in contact not just with organizations of indigenous peoples or, you know, promoting these languages, but also now we're in contact with the users. This is going to come, my contact with the actual users is going to come in the next few months, but I don't think any of them are refugees. So the short answer is no, but it would be great if it did happen.
Yeah, and I can see that you're very busy as well with your book and the new app coming out. This has been truly wonderful, and I've had so much fun, and it was so interesting to listen to this discussion. Unfortunately, I think it's time to start wrapping up. So I was wondering if there is anything that you want to mention or highlight in relation to our discussion, Katerina, as like last words before we wrap up.
It's been very interesting. You have asked me to rethink some of the fundamental questions about language and identity. I hope I managed to answer some of them. And I hope at least, you know, these questions are very difficult to answer in a sort of binary way. But it's very useful to start conversations. And I'd like to thank you and Bilingualism Matters for starting the conversation. And I hope we can continue the conversation. So I don't know if my email is available to people.
We'll make sure it will be.
So, oh, I can see an Efcharisto from somebody there. Oh, thank you. You can always. So I see Efcharisto, shukran, gracias, grazie, merci, arigato, and tesecular. Okay. So we have a very multilingual person there who used, you know,
Beautiful.
Turkish, Arabic, Greek, and Japanese, and all that. You know, thank you from me. But as I said, thank you for starting the conversation. But please continue the conversation. And if you feel that some of the questions haven't been answered, or if you want to take things forward, yes, this is my email address. Please do email me, and I'll be happy to continue it, because these are important conversations that we need to have, you know, in order to progress. So
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
And thank you as well. Round of applause from everyone silently in their homes.